Samuel's Choice, illustrated by James Watling and written by Richard Burlap. Here's a book that is set during the Revolutionary War time. Let me just read the back to you. It said Samuel, a young boy in Brooklyn in 1776. If I can make that a little more visual for you. Works hard loading bags in a flour mill and sailing people across the river for his master, the stingy Mr. Van Ditmas. Watching seagulls flying as they please over New York Harbor, Samuel wonders what it is like to be free. So I think we can pretty safely infer between the phrase his master and that wondering that he's a slave. He also wonders what it's like, what it is that makes people think they can change their lives. The American Sons of Liberty are fighting for their freedom against the King of England's army. When the fighting between the British and the colonists reaches the flour mill, Samuel realizes that only he can help the rebels. All alone, he is faced with a difficult choice. Is this freedom? Sounds like a pretty good book to me and perfect for what we're doing in social studies right now. So let's explore this book. So here we have a New York map, okay? You can see Long Island over here, or New York during this time period anyway. Okay, Brooklyn Heights. So it said that he was in Brooklyn. Here we've got the East River, okay, the bay. And I would bet that this is supposed to be his sailboat. Trying to make it so you guys can read it too. My master, Isaac Van Ditmas, was a very rich farmer. In my 14th year, he bought me from his old aunt in Flushing and took me from my parents to work as a slave in his flour mill on Gowanus Creek in Brooklyn. That same time, he bought Sana Williams, Toby, and others to keep the gardens and kitchen of his big house on the New York Harbor. At the end of Long Island, the heights of Brooklyn overlooked the East River and Manhattan Island. To the south lay the town of Brooklyn. It was only a small one in those days. The long South Road ran across Long Island hills through the fields of wheat and rye, connecting Brooklyn town with the Narrows at the entrance of New York Harbor. See the town there. Gowanus Creek, where the flour mill stood, wound out of this harbor into the green fields and lost itself in ponds and marshes. On a summer evening, mosquitoes rose like clouds from still waters and settled stinging on the bare arms and necks. Farmer Isaac was a strict man. One day, our day began at sunrise and ended when the light faded. Round and round, the gray stone wheel rolled and rumbled all day long, driven by tides flowing in and out of the creek. We ground wheat to make bread at the mill. We shoveled the flour into bags and loaded the bags into boats to be brought to the bakers in Manhattan. But little bread we ever saw. Van Ditmas was a stingy man. Many nights I went to bed with my stomach growling and only the taste of raw flour on my lips. Doesn't sound like much of a life, does it? see if I can adjust this a little bit. So you can see it here. That's better. And I don't have to hold it up. When Farmer Isaac saw that I had grown strong and could row a boat well, he taught me about the currents and flow between Brooklyn and Manhattan, about setting a sail and holding a course. I was to row Mrs. Van Ditmas and her daughters over to Manhattan or down the Brooklyn shore to Staten Island across the harbor. Isaac shook me by the collar and warned me never to row or sail except where he sent me. I was his property, according to the laws of Crown Colony, and he could do whatever he wanted with me. Work you do not choose to do is always tiring, and even the house slaves who labored in Farmer Isaac's kitchen got little sleep and less food. Whenever I felt the fresh sea breeze on my face, I would look up at the gulls flying where they pleased, and I would dream. I wondered how it was to be free like them, to go where I wanted. See if I can make this even better. That seems better. America's being ruled by the King of England was not a separate country, and these were troubled times in all the colonies. The night came when Manhattan Island was lit up like daytime with 100 bonfires. We gathered on the steps of the great house and heard the cheers and shouts echo over the water. Then came the sound of drums and fiefs, songs, and cannon firing. Sorry. What's all that racket over there? Sana asked. That's the sound of people going free, old Toby answered. Free from the King of England, free from the likes of Van Ditmas. How they got free? Toby? Why, they up and said they was free, girl, and wrote those words down on paper. Sana laughed. You got to do more than say you're free. That King and Isaac. Do they care what anybody say? What was it, I wondered, that made people think they could change their lives? They called their freedom liberty, and they marched through Brooklyn town cheering for that liberty. When the Sons of Liberty finally came waving their flags, Isaac locked us in the house. In the kitchen, the servants argued. Liberty ain't for Africans, one said. And it got nothing to do with us, another said. But Sana just shook her head. She was 15 and had been to church school. She could write her name and could read. Nobody here's going to be free unless they take the risk. Open your eyes. War is coming to Brooklyn between that English king and the Sons of Liberty. We can't say who will win. We can't say how many black slaves are ever going to get free. But one thing is sure, we're never going to happen under Isaac Van Ditmas. The talk made my head spin. One moment it seemed to offer hope, and then the arguments turned, and I didn't feel hope anymore. One day, Liberty men nailed a proclamation to a tree by South Road, but before anyone could tell me what it said, Isaac came and tore it down and stamped on it in the dust. That was the day Sana promised she would teach me to read. That writing, Samuel, she said later, was the Declaration of Independence made by Thomas Jefferson in the Congress of Philadelphia. So remember, just the Declaration didn't make the colonies free, but it was the point in the war where they said, we're fighting for our freedom. So the summer of 1776, my 14th one, passed on. Day by day, my back and arms grew stronger with hard work. More than once, I looked up from filling flour sacks to find a cool jar of buttermilk left by Sana. Then I'd drink the milk and fill the empty jar with flour. When she fetched the jar back, she would hide it. One day, I asked her what she wanted with so much flour. She just smiled and said, "That flour will be bread for our Freedom Day." While I sailed on Farmer Jack's errands or loaded sacks of flour, the war crept towards Brooklyn. One fine morning, we woke up in the slave quarters to the thunder of great guns out in the harbor. I ran to the house. Sana just kept on calmly with her work. "Washington's come to New York," she said, grinning. "Those are guns of the governor's island practicing to scare off the British." Well, the gun sure scared off Farmer Isaac. After Washington arrived, he and Miss Van Ditmas never crossed Manhattan again. I hoisted the sail of my boat to carry the farmer's wife and daughters with all their trunks to an old uncle's house on Staten Island. And there on Staten Island, I saw them. The King's army had come from across the sea and on the hillside meadows had pitched its tents by the thousands. The sun glinted on rows of brass cannon and bayonets. Redcoats came down from the hills. They spread over the green grass like streams of blood. And they sat in the barges, sorry about the ringing, and were rowed across the Brooklyn shore. A barge passed nearby. We saw the smiling, sunburned face of the soldiers. "Hurrah!" they cheered, and the Van Ditmas girls waved and giggled. Back in the kitchen of the big house, I told what I'd seen. "Those great ships have hundreds of cannon." Toby said, "There's got to be thousands of redcoats." Somebody else said, "And they gonna whip those Liberty boys, but good." "General Washington will find a way," Sonia said, but her eyes held back tears. "It can't just end like this." Old Toby put an arm around her. "Trouble is, dear, it can. These Americans are setting up to fight their king, and that means all the king's ships and men and cannon. No business for us black folk, I'm telling you," said Joseph Martin. "Not with Isaac down so hard on the Liberty boys," Loretta added. It seemed to me that the slaves were right. I could not think of how ordinary Americans I had seen, fresh from their farms and shops, would ever drive away an army of real soldiers. Next day, while I loaded sacks into a wagon, I heard the sound of fiefs and drums. Southwards along the road past the mill came 100 of Washington's recruits, their feet shuffling in dust, An American officer rode beside them on a gray farmhouse. "Captain," Sonia called to him. "Thousands of them are landing down the shore." "We know that, girl," he called back. "Don't worry, we'll handle them lobster backs. General Washington himself is coming over to Brooklyn." But the men marching past us didn't look so sure. Many seemed frightened. Some were barefoot. Some looked hungry and sick. Their flags drooped as they passed. Sana read the names of the colonies embroidered on their banners: Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Rhode Island. They had come from far away to a strange place. Farmer Isaac stood by the fence puffing on his pipe. "You be quiet, girl. This ain't no fight of yours. If them fools want to break the king's law, they can get themselves killed with no help from my slaves." Sonia shook her head. I knew she felt sorry for the ragged men and the boys marching past. Maybe they were not fighting for her liberty, not yet, but freedom had to start somewhere. That summer, it was starting in Brooklyn. When the officer was gone, and Isaac too, one of his men stopped the wagon. He stood there and stared at me. "You thirsty?" I asked him. He nodded and held his empty canteen upside down. I snatched my jug of buttermilk out of the wagon and poured it into the canteen. The boy took a long drink. "Thanks," he said. "My name's Nathaniel. Joined up in Boston on my 14th birthday." "You know how to shoot that thing?" I asked, pointing at the musket. "Think so," he muttered. "Shot it yesterday in camp." "You scared?" I asked him. "No, I ain't," he said. "Well, you ought to be," I told him. All day long the guns crashed and boomed on the Long Island hills while the mill wheel rumbled and ground soldiers rushed down the South Road. It was awful nice of him to give that buttermilk, considering how little he gets to eat. Now, I want you to be thinking as I'm continuing to read, this is not written as a nonfiction book, but we certainly know that a lot of this happens. So, what are the facts, do you think, that are being presented? Suddenly, there was a shouting. A soldier appeared in the doorway. "The British are coming," he cried. "The Americans are running." The road filled with crowds of American soldiers now running north along the road back toward Washington's lines. Tired, frightened people, most were sopping wet. Where they stopped to rest, the dust turned to mud under their feet. Cannonballs were whizzing through the air. One crashed through the roof of the mill. Farmer Isaac was nowhere to be seen. Sonia knelt by someone who had fallen beside the road. She tied a strip of petticoat around a bloody gash in his leg. He was soaked and shaking, and when I looked at his face, I saw that he was Nathaniel, the boy with the empty canteen. "Stop staring," Sonia shouted at me. "He's trembling. Wrap him in them empty sacks." Nathaniel told us how he swam across the Gowanus Creek to escape the British, but the tide was rising fast. Dozens of Americans were wounded and many couldn't swim. The army was trapped without boats in the swamps around the creek. Some were still fighting, but lots of the soldiers were being shot like ducks in marshes. Washington's men needed help badly. You can see up here where the Cannonball went through the roof. Sonia's eyes pleaded with me. She knew I tied my boat in reeds along the creek. Her look said, "It's up to you, Samuel." Nathaniel groaned. The small red spot in his bandage had begun to spread. Toby had come and was kneeling beside Sonia. He shrugged. "You got the boat, Samuel. It's your choice." Ooh. Title of the book, Samuel's Choice. Sonia and Toby got set to carry Nathaniel up the road into the American lines. Sonia caught me looking at the bag on her shoulder. "That's my freedom flower," she said. "I'm going where I can bake my freedom loaf." A moment later, more soldiers ran between us, and when they passed, Sonia, Toby, and Nathaniel were gone. All at once, the road was empty. From away in the distance came the roar of muskets. Isaac Van Ditmas was gone. Sonia was gone. The soldiers were gone. I was alone. Was this freedom? I thought about the boy, Nathaniel, from far away, how a lot more people just like him were trapped in marshes along the creek, and how Isaac sneered at them, and how the British king from across the water sent his soldiers to shoot and imprison them. I looked at my hands, grown strong from pulling ropes and oars and sacks. I knew my choice. Those hands now were going to pull people, pull them to freedom. I ran to the creek, pushed the boat out into the rushing tide, and slid the oars into their locks. On the opposite bank, Americans were wading in the muddy water up to their waists, shouting for help. In the distance, others were holding the British back from the water's edge. Great clouds of gun smoke rolled over these brave soldiers. When the air cleared, I could see fewer and fewer of them. As I pulled near, wet and weary men flopped onto the boat. Others clung to the sides. "Row, row," they shouted. I pulled on the oars with all my might. Out we shot into the current. Bullets splashed in the waters near us. When we reached the far bank, the men cheered. I turned again into the creek and rowed back for more. 6 times I crossed the creek. Each time the battle grew closer, the fleeing Americans fewer. By now, muddy water slopped around my ankles. My back ached from pulling on the oars. Why do you think he would get involved in this, Samuel, if it wasn't his road to freedom? Just as I was raising the sail to race out of the creek, I glimpsed a big man in a blue coat and a 3-corner hat along the bull reeds. He threw himself into the boat and ordered me to sail for Washington's camp. The British were close behind him. As we fled down the creek into New York Harbor, they fired at us from the banks. And when the big man had caught his breath, he pointed up at a sail. The black holes gaped in the canvas. "Musket balls," he said, and winked. "Compliments of General Cornwallis." That was one of the English soldiers, one of the leaders, the general. As the boat carried us into the harbor, I steered northward along the Brooklyn shore toward Brooklyn Heights and Washington's camp. I wondered what Farmer Isaac would say about his torn sail. But most of all, I wondered what happened to Sonia and Toby. My passenger's name was Major Mordecai Gist. He commanded the Maryland soldiers who had held back the British while other Americans escaped. "Oh, what brave boys I lost today," said Major Gist. "And this war has only begun." He asked how I came to be fishing men out of the creek, and I told him about Farmer Isaac, Sonia, And Nathaniel. When I tied the boat to the dock below the heights, Major Gist clapped his hands on my shoulder and looked at me in the eyes. Samuel, he said, out in that creek, you did more than many a free man for your country. I'd take it as a privilege if you'd consent to be my orderly and march beside me. And General Washington may need handy boatmen like you soon enough. The next day it rained and rained. A thick sea fog covered the land. I looked everywhere for Sonia. Many soldiers crowded into the camp, but they could tell me nothing. Alone and frightened, I mended the holes in my sail, pushing the big needle through the canvas, drawing it back again. Then I heard voices nearby. Major Gist stood there with an officer in a fine blue uniform. They asked me how deep the water was at the point between Brooklyn and Manhattan. They wanted to know if British ships could sail between the two places. I told them most ships could. Only the fog was keeping the British men of war from trapping Washington's army on Long Island. The officer in the blue uniform thanked me. He and Major Gist walked away, looking thoughtful. The next day, the heavy rains continued. I spread the sail over the boat and slept snug and dry. When I heard the voice I missed more than any in the world calling, Samuel! Samuel Abraham! Sonia had found me. It was not a dream. You chose Samuel, she said. You did it right. You chose our new country. From under her cloak, she took a hot, steaming loaf wrapped in a napkin. Her freedom bread, the sweetest I'd ever tasted. While we ate, she told me that Toby and Nathaniel were safe. But this new country was in danger. Major Gist came to me again and explained that every boat was needed to carry Washington's army from Brooklyn to Manhattan. The army had to retreat that night. I was going to save the army with Farmer Isaac's boat. Wouldn't he be surprised? On the night that General Washington's army left Brooklyn, the worst storm I'd ever seen blew in from the northeast. The wind howled. It drove the rain stinging into our eyes. It shook buildings and knocked down chimneys, and it whipped the water at Brooklyn Ferry into a sea of foam. Down from the heights in the file marched Washington's army. The men entered the boats Major Gist and the others had gathered at the ferry landing. What we need is a rope to cling to, someone said in the dark, a rope stretching from here to Manhattan to guide us against the wind and the current. There's rope here in the shipyard, a soldier remembered, buoys to float the rope across, too. But who can cross this flood in the dark? Can you do it, Samuel? Major Gist asked. Can you get across with the rope? I can do it, Major, I shouted, the wind tearing the words out of my mouth. But I wasn't sure. Even if the rope were fed out from the shore slowly, the sail might split or the rope might tear down the mast. But the British ships were sure to force their way between Brooklyn and Manhattan. I had to try. When the rope was ready, I tried. I tied it to the foot of the mast. Sonia jumped into my boat. I shouted at her to stay behind, but she wouldn't move. There was no time to lose. I shoved off into the swirling current. Once again, he's proving to be very brave. My only hope was to let the shore current carry me into the midstream, and then, as the wind and tide thrust the boat toward the other shore, raise the sail and race for the Manhattan landing. Fighting the rudder, I heard Sonia's voice in my ear. "Will we make it, Samuel?" Water crashed over the side. Sonia was bailing as fast as she could. "I can't swim, Samuel," she cried into the wind. We were halfway across Manhattan, and the boat was filling with the sea. The gale was spinning us around. The rope was pulling us backward. I heaved at the sail, praying the mending wouldn't tear. Then, as the sail filed, the boom swung around with a crack, and we were darting forward at last. On the Manhattan landing, by lantern light, we could see people waiting. Over the roar of the storm, we could hear them cheering us on, but Isaac's boat was sinking. The rope was tearing the mast out from the bottom. With a terrible crash, the mast broke and carried over the side. A second later, the bow smashed into the side of the wharf. I found myself in the water, swimming with one arm, clinging to Sonia with the other. We stumbled ashore on Manhattan Island, where kind people wrapped us in blankets. They were smiling. The rope was across. The boats full of Washington soldiers would follow. We had done it together. All through the night, Washington's men followed the rope, the boat after boat across the water. Washington's men followed the rope, boat after boat, across the water. In the stormy darkness, every soldier escaped from Long Island. And so the fight for freedom would go on. It would take many long years before we would beat the British king, but never again did I wonder what freedom was or what it cost. It was people pulling together. It was strong hands helping. It was one person caring about another. And where was Washington? Many times that night, Sonia and I hoped to see him. "Why, Samuel," Major Gist told us later, "he was the officer in the blue coat who asked you how deep the water was between Brooklyn and Manhattan. Last night, the general arrested a farmer in Brooklyn for helping the British. That farmer was Isaac Van Ditmas, and turned all of his property over to the Army of the Continental Congress in exchange for his freedom. It seems now that you and Sonia have no master." From that day forward, we and Isaac's other slaves were to be citizens of the new nation. Historical note. So this is the part that we learn really where the facts are. The Battle of Long Island was George Washington's first battle in the American War for Independence. It was a defeat. From Brooklyn, General Washington retreated to Manhattan, then to New Jersey, and in the last month of 1776, he crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Thus ended one of the longer and more bitter retreats in American history. On the day after Christmas, Washington crossed the icy Delaware once more into New Jersey. There, at Trenton and again at Princeton, his soldiers, many of whom had escaped from Brooklyn, defeated their enemy. In 1781, General Cornwallis finally surrendered at Yorktown. The British troops were fired on Samuel at Gowanus Creek on August 27th. The 1776 were commanded by General Cornwallis. Major Mordecai Gist led the Maryland state troops in the Battle of Long Island. He and Isaac Van Ditmas are historical figures, although the arrest of Van Ditmas did not actually occur. Samuel Abraham and Sonia Williams are fictional, but modeled on the many nameless people of Brooklyn, slaves and free, who made Washington's escape possible. So one thing we do know is that many slaves fought for both sides of the war. Both sides eventually offered them freedom and said that it was their chance for freedom. And for some, that was true, that they ended up helping the colonists and did manage to earn their freedom. But for many, unfortunately, that didn't prove to be true. And even after the country won their independence, they went back to being slaves.